Chapter 9 War of the Flea by Robert Tabor. Failures in the War of the Flea. Magsaysay and the Huks in the Philippines. The price of British victory in Malaya, why the Communists lost in Greece. Mao's analogy of the gorilla swimming like a fish in the sea of the population is so often repeated because it contains an essential truth. It expresses accurately as well as picturesquely the fundamental principle of guerrilla war. Carry the analogy a step further and ask what happens when the fish is removed, or removes himself, from the water. The answer explains, better than a treatise, the reason for the failure of the few guerrilla movements that have been successfully suppressed. The destruction in 1949 of the Greek communist guerrilla forces of the Democratic Army is a prime example. Malaya is another. The Hukbalahap insurrection in the Philippines is perhaps a third. All three show what happens when guerrillas are cut off, or deliberately cut themselves off, as the Greek communists did, from popular contact and support. The Huk movement, which, like so many others, had its origin in World War II, offers more instruction to the counterinsurgency strategists than do the others, because it exemplifies the successful use of political and social rather than military weapons against guerrillas. Credit for the success of the Philippine pacification campaign seems to go largely to a single intelligent politician, the late President Ramon Magsaysay, who became Secretary of National Defense in 1950, at a time when the Huks appeared almost on the point of invading Manila itself. The Huks, like the Viet Minh in Indochina, ELAS in Greece, the Malayan communists, and other insurgents in Axis-held territory throughout the world during World War II, had come into being as a patriotic force. Nationalist guerrillas opposing a foreign invader, with the blessings, practical instruction, and material aid of the Allied powers, specifically of the United States. But revolutionary motivations are complex. The Huks had been fighting for something as well as against something. Wartime slogans had been taken seriously, and, with the war over and the Japanese driven from the islands, social aspirations eclipsed even independence, granted conditionally in 1946, as a motivating force. The men who had been fighting the Japanese were now fighting for themselves. They demanded a political voice and a share of the land for which they had fought. Magsaysay, a former guerrilla himself, was clever enough to see what was required, and influential enough to get it. When he took office in 1950, the Huks, dominating central Luzon and much of Mindanao, Mindanao, the second largest island of the chain, commanded some 12,000 armed guerrillas and had the active cooperation of an estimated 1 million Filipinos in a nation of 17 million. An army of 30,000 soldiers was helpless to contain them. The stockpiles of weapons captured from the Japanese or supplied during the war by the United States would have been sufficient to keep a civil war in progress for decades. And the bulk of the population, if not actively sympathetic to the insurgents, was at least passive. The terrain, mountains and swampy jungle, favored the guerrillas. The troops, hated by the villagers, were confined to the larger centers of population and were seldom seen in the back country except on sporadic punitive expeditions, and then only in full force, an invading army arriving in trucks and armored vehicles to terrorize the rural population. Magsaysay's first step was to reorganize the army and put an end to military terrorism. Pressure against the Huks was increased by sending out small armed units functioning more like constabularies than troops to hunt down the guerrillas piecemeal, while devoting most of the army to social work, setting up medical stations, building schoolhouses, repairing roads and bridges, helping the peasants get their rice to market. His second step, and the first would have been useless without it, was to obtain legislation that made it possible to offer the Huks what they had been fighting for, on the condition that they lay down their arms. An amnesty was proclaimed, and the communist slogan, "Land for the Landless," was subverted by an agrarian reform and resettlement program under which any guerrilla who surrendered was given a plot of his own. Clever bribery worked where other inducements did not. Substantial bounties were paid for weapons. Rewards were put on the heads of key Huk leaders, and subsequent betrayals disrupted the direction of the guerrilla campaign, cutting the roving bands off from their urban base in Manila, where virtually the entire rebel political directorate was captured. In 1951, troops were set to guard the ballot boxes as an honest election, possibly the first in Filipino history, was conducted, leading to further social reforms that progressively weakened the communist appeal. By the time the Huk leader, Louis TAROC, surrendered in 1954. The rural villages were firmly in the hands of the government, and the Huks had been reduced, more by defections than otherwise, to a few thousands, scattered over the less accessible mountain and jungle areas of the two main islands. They still had not been defeated militarily. Indeed, they have not been entirely eliminated to this day, and lately they have shown signs of reviving. But they had lost the propaganda war and their popular appeal. Their cause had been stolen from them by a government far more popular, thanks in part to an economy bolstered by $620 million of American aid. That's $620 million. Than any that had ruled before, and thus they had been isolated slowly but surely from the support on which their successful existence depended. It is a matter of speculation whether the Huks could not have accomplished more by better exploiting their strength when they had it. One of their signal weaknesses seems to have been their failure to establish anything like a popular front during a period when urban support, the participation of students, industrial workers, and the poorer white-collar class was clearly required. The insurrection was a peasant movement and remained confined to the rural areas. Although the guerrillas dominated the villages in 1949 to 50, they never seriously disrupted the economy of the islands or the life of the capital. Their tactics in the field, mainly evasive, failed to produce the kind of results that could be exploited in terms of propaganda for major political effect. And, once deprived of political leadership, they seem to have lapsed into an existence hardly to be distinguished from banditry, surrendering the political as well as the military initiative to Manila. Militarily, a force of 12,000 guerrillas with strong support in the countryside, opposed by a relatively small army of only 30,000 men, should have been able to concentrate a sufficient strength in any given place to reduce any but the strongest of garrisons or to capture any but the largest of towns. The Huks failed to do so. As saboteurs, they should have been able to initiate an aggressive campaign of destruction that would have crippled communications and paralyzed the national economy. Far smaller forces have done it elsewhere, but again the Huks failed. Unwilling or psychologically unable to take the initiative, they failed to seize and hold the popular imagination so to create the broad mass unrest needed to topple the government or to build a revolutionary army capable of confronting and defeating the government army. Public opinion, says Clausewitz, is ultimately gained by great victories. The Huks needed, if not great victories, then a strong foretaste of success in order to create the bandwagon effect on which successful revolutionary movements are built. They had made a good start, but they failed to exploit it. Magsaysay's reforms came in time to blunt the edge of popular grievances and to broaden the political base of the regime, while narrowing that of the Huk movement to the point where it was virtually eliminated as a revolutionary force. In post-war Malaya, the situation was radically different from that of the Philippines, despite certain obvious similarities. There was a strong communist guerrilla movement. As in the Philippines, it had been schooled by experts. Indeed, Chin Peng, the Secretary-General of the Malayan Communist Party, had been described during the war as Britain's most trusted guerrilla, and some 200 party members had learned irregular warfare a few years earlier in the British Army Special Training School in Singapore. In addition, there was an extensive political organization, the Minyuen, M-I-N-Y-U-E-N, or Masses' movement, reaching into virtually every town and village of any consequence on the Malayan Peninsula. Unfortunately for the communists, however, the so-called Malayan Races Liberation Army, MRLA, had very few Malayans in it, being composed almost exclusively of Chinese and more particularly of the large squatter population of recent Chinese immigrants with no deep roots in the country. The guerrillas, with a total strength variously estimated at 5,000 to 10,000, were able to launch a campaign of terrorism and sabotage that was initially effective. But their weakness in the long run lay in the comparative ease with which they could be isolated. The jungle in which they necessarily found refuge was inhabited not by farmers but by tribal aborigines, scarcely able to grow enough food to support themselves. Consequently, the food on which the guerrillas relied had to be smuggled from the villages through the Minyuen network, and this was soon halted by vigilant police activity. A massive and costly resettlement program removed more than 500,000 Chinese squatters, mostly tin mine and rubber plantation workers, from their shacks on the fringe of the jungle to protected villages where they could be kept under surveillance and at the same time offered advantages that tended to woo them for their political connection with the insurgents. The latter, cut off from contact with the mass of the population, lacking the material support of even the Chinese community on which they had relied, were then slowly starved into submission or lured into ambushes in which they were reduced piecemeal. The resettlement program, the prototype of the protected villages experiment in South Vietnam, is of some interest to counterinsurgency specialists, as are some of the methods developed by the British to combat the Chinese guerrillas in the Malayan jungle. What is of principal interest in the Malayan experience, however, is not the defeat of the MRLA, a foredoomed effort in any event, but the duration of the suppression campaign and its extremely high cost. Despite the obvious handicaps under which they fought, the Chinese communist guerrillas in Malaya still had not been eliminated as a fighting force a full 10 years after the struggle began. Indeed, a few hundred guerrillas still survive in the jungle, although they are no longer considered dangerous. During the 10 years they fought, they tied up British forces 140,000 strong, including 40,000 regular troops and about 100,000 regular and auxiliary police. The expense of the military effort can be judged by the following detailed account of Operation Nassau, Nassau, described as typical of battalion-sized British counter-guerrilla operations in Malaya. Quote, this is a long quote. Operation Nassau began in December 1954 and ended in September 1955. The South Swamp of Kuala Langat, Langat, covers an area of over 100 square miles. It is a dense jungle with trees up to 150 feet tall where visibility is limited to about 30 yards. After several assassinations, a British battalion was assigned to the area. Food control was achieved through a system of rationing, convoys, gate checks, and searches. One company began operations in the swamp about December 21, 1954. On January 9, 1955, full-scale tactical operations began. Artillery, mortars, and aircraft began harassing fires in South Swamp. Originally, the plan was to bomb and shell the swamp day and night so that the terrorists would be driven out into ambushes, but the terrorists were well prepared to stay indefinitely. Food parties came out occasionally, but the civil population was too afraid to report them. Plans were modified. Harassing fires were reduced to nighttime only. Ambushes continued and patrolling inside the swamp was intensified. Operations of this nature continued for 3 months without results. Finally, on March 21st, an ambush party, about 45 hours of waiting, succeeded in killing 2 of 8 terrorists. The first 2 red pins, signifying kills, appeared on the operations map and local morale rose a little. Another month passed before it was learned that terrorists were making a contact inside the swamp. 1 platoon established an ambush, 1 terrorist appeared and was killed. May passed without a contact. In June, a chance meeting by a patrol accounted for 1 killed and 1 captured. A few days later, after 4 fruitless days of patrolling, 1 platoon en route to camp around accounted for 2 more terrorists. A few days later, after 4 fruitless days of patrolling, 1 platoon en route to camp accounted for 2 more terrorists. The number 3 terrorist in the area surrendered and reported that food control was so effective that 1 terrorist had been murdered in a quarrel over food. On July 7th, 2 additional companies were assigned to the area. Patrolling and harassing fires were intensified. 3 terrorists surrendered and 1 of them led a platoon patrol to the terrorist leader's camp. The patrol attacked the camp, killing 4, including the leader. Other patrols accounted for 4 more by the end of July. 23 terrorists remained in the swamp with no food or communications with the outside world. This was the nature of operations. 60,000 artillery shells, 30,000 rounds of mortar ammunition, and 2,000 aircraft bombs for 35 terrorists killed or captured. Each one represented 1,500 man-days of patrolling or waiting in ambushes. Nassau was considered a success, for the end of the emergency was 1 step nearer. That was from the Marine Corps School's Small Unit Operations in The Guerrilla and How to Fight Him. 9 months of continuous effort by an entire battalion backed by artillery and aircraft, with the expenditure of more artillery and mortar shells and aerial bombs than exist in the arsenals of some Latin American republics, to eliminate 35 guerrillas. At such cost, the defeat of the Chinese communists in Malaya can be nothing less than inspirational to potential guerrillas of other, less sternly guarded countries. How many of the shaky Latin American regimes could meet the expense, let alone the political risks of such a campaign, if it involved not 35 but 1,000 determined guerrillas? For how long? The British Exchequer exchequer could, one supposes, conveniently stand the strain. Even so, there was more to the reckoning than the military payroll and the spectacular expenditure of ammunition. Undoubtedly, the long-drawn MRLA insurrection, rootless and essentially hopeless as it was, hastened the independence of Malaya by some years. We come to Greece, a case history of another sort. The 3-year Greek Revolution, successfully put down by a rightist government with the help of Britain and the United States, offers instruction to those interested in knowing how not to conduct a guerrilla war. In Greece, 1946 to 49, virtually all of the lessons of experience were ignored. All of the rules laid down by the Marxist-Leninist theoreticians of revolutionary warfare were broken by the very communists who might have been expected to adhere most closely to them. As in other areas, the conclusion of World War II in Greece left the communist leaders in an advantageous position, materially and politically. Communism and anti-fascism were closely identified because it was the communists who had dominated the ELAS resistance movement. Thus, the party held a strong ideological position. Thousands of ELAS veterans were at the disposal of the revolutionary movement. And although ELAS had made a token surrender of its weapons in 1945, the best of the arms supplied to the resistance groups by the British and Americans during the war remained in the hands of the guerrillas when civil war broke out in 1946. Although the communist guerrillas were numerically weak, with perhaps 2,500 fighting men in 1946, as opposed to a national gendarmerie, no idea. National gendarmerie of 30,000, a good start was made, and recruits to the communist cause poured in. The fighting began in the northern mountains along Greece's common borders with Albania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria, soon spread to south-central Greece, and then into the mountains of the Peloponnesus. The reprisals taken by extreme right-wing groups added fuel to the flames, spreading the conflict. The communist campaign was initiated along theoretically sound lines. The Democratic Army fought in guerrilla fashion, in small units capable of dispersing and hiding or even mingling with the civil population when in trouble, yet able to concentrate locally superior forces swiftly for attacks on village police posts and small patrols. As the guerrillas grew stronger, the police were forced to abandon the smaller posts and to withdraw for safety into the larger towns. The Athens government, seeing the danger, hastily began to rebuild the army, which had been reduced to virtually nothing during the German occupation. The troops sent into the mountains to subdue the guerrillas encountered the same tactics. They were unable to hold small posts, unable to move freely except in considerable strength. Worse still, they were unable to maintain sufficient forces along the northern borders to prevent the passage of men and supply trains from Albania and Yugoslavia, where some 4,000 ELAS veterans had gone when the German occupation had ended. Thus, the Democratic Army could depend on an inviolate rear area across the border in which to establish hospitals, training camps, and supply bases. The supplies moving into Greece by two main routes, one directly from Yugoslavia and the other from Yugoslavia to Albania and then southward. The military strategy of the Greek guerrillas has been correctly defined as neither defensive nor offensive, but evasive. In short, it was the war of the flea, a nip here, a bite there, and a quick retreat. The object was to bleed the army, and through it, the Athens government. Military objectives were subordinated to political goals. By cutting communications, sowing civil disorder, increasing the tax burden enormously, disrupting the economic life of the country, the communists reasonably hoped to undermine the Athens regime and to create social, economic, and political pressures that would, in time, bring about its collapse. In the field, the campaign went well, perhaps too well. The small bands of guerrillas grew rapidly. By early 1947, the Democratic Army was fighting in battalion strength. A year later, brigades were formed, and then entire divisions, 8 in all, organized roughly along the lines of conventional army divisions. The Democratic Army's initial strength had been about 2,500 at its peak. It reached 26,000, later declining to some 18,500 toward the end of the war. Early success and other factors, the support given Athens by the British and then by the Americans, and that given the Democratic Army by their 3 communist countries north of the border, led to serious, indeed fatal errors. I've got to drink some more of my coffee here. I'm messing up bad. The first was to lose effective contact with the Greek population. For reasons relating perhaps partly to political security, partly to simple material expedience, the communists early in the campaign began to raid the villages from which the gendarmes, had been driven, and to strip them of their cattle, their food supplies, and eventually of their inhabitants, the latter being either forcibly inducted into the Democratic Army or driven out of the guerrilla base areas entirely. Hordes of refugees from the war zones created something of a problem for Athens, but at heavy cost politically to the communists, in terms of prestige and popular support throughout Greece. There were also military consequences. With a civil population in the war zones, the government had to think twice about bombing villages and scattered dwellings. Civilians presented a serious problem of target identification to government pilots, who could not always know whether they were strafing a guerrilla mule supply train or a group of farmers on their way to market. With the war zones emptied of all but combatants, the bomber pilots as well as the troops on the ground had a free hand. Anything that moved, except government soldiers whose positions were known, was automatically a target. The second major blunder of the Democratic Army, made for reasons till not earlier clear, The second major blunder of the Democratic Army, made for reasons till not entirely clear. There you go. Till is what it should be, still. Made for reasons still not entirely clear, was to begin in 1947 to try to hold ground, adopting conventional defensive tactics for which their inferior numbers, light arms, and weak logistical system were entirely unsuited. The guerrillas had grown strong. 18,000 to 26,000 men is a formidable force for guerrillas. They were, however, obviously no match in any clear test of strength against an army and a national defense corps, which together commanded some 265,000 men, supported by armor, artillery, and more than adequate air force. Political considerations apparently entered into the communist decision to attempt the transition from guerrilla warfare to more conventional operations. First, the use of troops in brigade and divisional strength, then the attempt to hold ground in the north. A communist government had been formed, and it required a territorial base. If world recognition was to be sought for a free Greece, it had to be demonstrated that such a Greece existed. No doubt, other factors bore on the decision. The communists certainly needed, and in any case would have been reluctant to dispense with, their foreign bases and the supplies that came by mule train from Yugoslavia. To keep the borders open may have been one of the objects of the Democratic Army's defensive operations in the north. Mistaken or not, the Democratic Army was at first successful in holding ground. In the summer of 1948, 12,000 to 15,000 communist troops held off 50,000 government soldiers for 2.5 months in the Gramos Mountains, over an area of some 200 square miles. When the pressure became too great, the Democratic Army withdrew into Albania, only to reappear in the Mount Vitsi region to the northeast, where a successful defense was made against renewed army operations. Within 6 months, the guerrillas had again established themselves in the Gramos. The government campaign in the north was, for the time being, defeated. Defeat forced Athens to take drastic steps. General Alexander Papagos, former chief of the Army General Staff, was recalled from retirement and given what amounted to a free hand in reorganizing the army, with authority to raise its strength to 250,000 if necessary. Unsuitable officers were replaced by Papagos, and new, aggressive tactics were adopted. 25,000 men were thrown into battle in the Peloponnesus, where the communists had seized the offensive. By early 1949, the 3,600 guerrillas in that area had been liquidated, and the army was making good progress against those in central Greece. By the end of June, the Democratic Army had been defeated almost everywhere except in its Gramos and Mount Vitsi strongholds, and a strong offensive against these positions was in preparation. The communists, meanwhile, had been dealt a severe blow by the vagaries of international politics. Tito had fallen out with Stalin, Yugoslavia had left the common form, and in July, the Belgrade government closed its borders with Greece. Yugoslavia's action cut the guerrilla supply line into Macedonia and western Thrace, isolating some 4,000 communist reserves in Yugoslavia, and driving a wedge between the main force of communists in the Gramos-Vitsi area and the guerrillas in Bulgaria, eastern Macedonia, and Thrace. Some 5,000 in all. The Democratic Army was still able to obtain some supplies from Albania, but far fewer and of poorer quality than had come from Yugoslavia. Laboring against such difficulties, the Democratic Army proved unable long to resist better armed, better trained, and organized regular troops in vastly superior numbers and with full artillery and air support. Within 3 days in August, the Mount Vitzi force of 7,000 was overrun and 5,000 guerrillas fled north into Albania. The government offensive in the Gramos lasted 5 days. By the time it was over, 4,000 more guerrillas, the last remnants of the Democratic Army, had also withdrawn into Albania, and for all practical purposes, the civil war in Greece was at an end. Although thousands of erstwhile guerrillas and many more thousands of collaborators remained at large, scattered across the country, the revolution was destroyed beyond any hope of resurrection. It seems not unfair to say that, to a very great extent, it was destroyed by the communists themselves. Their alienation from the civil population in the northern mountains, the terrorism practiced against civilians, their dependence on foreign bases and supplies, and their premature decision in 1948 to hold ground and to expose large formations to a numerically, technologically, logistically, and organizationally superior army cost them a series of defeats from which there was no recovery. Their loss was twofold. They were defeated militarily, and the Greek army's success spelled defeat for the revolutionary movement politically as well. In the Greek context, the revolutionary principle bears repetition. The object of the guerrilla is not to win battles, but to avoid defeat, not to end the war, but to prolong it, until political victory, more important than any battlefield victory, has been won. In sacrificing the advantages of guerrilla tactics for military strategy based on territorial investment, the Greek communists oppose strength with weakness. In risking a military confrontation, they gambled not only their available manpower, but something more important: their political prestige as a revolutionary force able to defy, by skillful evasion and superior tactics, the military colossus. And in losing the gamble, they lost the essential momentum, the high sense of popular anticipation, the bandwagon effect on which the success of any political movement depends. Revolution is by definition a mass phenomenon. Greece, Malaya, and the Philippines all illustrate the axiom that without mass participation or at least popular support, there can be no revolutions. The Huks lost it, the Chinese and Malaya never had it, the Greek communists threw it away. That concludes Chapter 9, War of the Flea. And I appreciate it if, for those of you that actually stuck around. That was bad, and I promise to do better in the future.